Emily, what's on your radar?
Well, the most feminist statement made during this election cycle so far, I think probably came from Blake Masters, who argued in a campaign ad last year that Americans should be able to raise a family on one income. Back then, Ryan and I asked the Arizona Republican hopeful about that point. This was last July, after some feminists got upset about it. Here's the clip.
If your dad worked at the Ford auto plant in the 1950s, that single median wage was enough to support a family. You could buy a house, you could have a car, you could take a vacation. We used to be able to do that. Something broke very badly in the last few decades. Now people have to work 2 jobs, maybe even 3 or 4, just to run harder to stay in the same place. We've seen downward effect pressure on wages that have basically kept them flat since the early 70s. Meanwhile, the costs, the stuff that everybody needs to buy, healthcare, education, housing, that stuff just keeps rising. It doesn't work, and I think it's just commonsensical to point it out. And then when the Democrats want to say that's sexist, you got to wonder, what are they really saying?
So I thought back to Masters' ad this week when Sheryl Sandberg announced her soon-to-be departure from Meta. CNN called it, quote, the death knell for Lean In, which of course is the name of the hugely popular bestseller Sandberg wrote back in 2013. The book received some well-placed anti-corporate critiques from the feminist left at the time of its release. Sure, but the media establishment lavished Sandberg with praise. I was, sort of trying to remember how lavish that praise was. I briefly dug into the archive, and the balance of that coverage was clearly in Sandberg's favor, and hilariously so in some cases. The headlines are really funny if you go back and Google them. But in retrospect, this is embarrassing for a lot of reasons. Sandberg was using identity politics to dangle a shiny object in front of gullible journalists and corporatists who'd rather talk about, quote, banning bossy than Facebook's fundamentally anti-human, addictive, destructive business model. She was actively pushing and profiting off of the destruction of social capital and young minds at the time. Now, of course, she also was articulating a vision of equality that resonated with the educated workaholics in media, but insulted the rest of the country. So is the girl boss really dead, though? My colleague Madeline Osborne argued this week that COVID really was the nail in the coffin for the girl boss. Madeline pointed out that almost 2 million women have left the labor force since February 2020. That marks a 33-year record low. She also pointed out that it's possible remote work contributed to the first increase in the American birth rate in years. Madeline quotes Lyman Stone, who noted for the Institute for Family Studies last week that, quote, high satisfaction with family life among remote workers suggests that the positive associations of remote work with marriage and fertility probably are not spurious. These women are happier with their family lives. Taken together, these results do point to one possible explanation for the rapid rebound in births: expanded remote work. Check out this data from Gallup as well. Women with young children prefer to be homemakers. That sounds icky to a lot of women conditioned by our highly industrialized, globalized world to see themselves as widgets. Major corporations will freeze women's eggs for them. They'll cover the costs of that. That is not respect. It's dehumanizing. It's treating you as a cog in their machine. Working mothers are statistically inefficient. Yes, all the media coverage and girl boss nonsense is partially a cope for women who want to justify missing some reasonable personal milestones because of professional priorities. Sure. But it's also rooted in modern capitalism's effort to mold us into the most efficient cogs possible. So why does all the rhetoric of 2013 look even worse now? Sandberg, having stayed with a company that pretty much pissed everyone off in the years since Lean In hit bookshelves, didn't exactly receive a warm send-off this week, except of course from Mark Zuckerberg. This, I think, is partially good news. It's bad news in the sense that we live in a much more cynical world, but good news in the sense that our cynicism is entirely warranted. I would be concerned if we weren't appropriately cynical right now. The Trump era really tore the curtain back on our political and cultural establishments, and then COVID came along, then the unrest of 2020, and nobody is buying what they're selling anymore. So living in a highly industrialized, highly globalized world has pushed people to move away from their families, to become transients in new communities they don't buy property in and then bounce around where work takes them, to adopt standards of success that involve competing on a global scale as an individual. I think we know better now than to let Sheryl Sandberg set the standards for our lives. Ryan, Blake Masters is interesting because, of course, he's worked for Peter Thiel. He wrote 0 to 1 with Peter Thiel, and Peter Thiel has had heavy involvement with Facebook for years. And so it seems like maybe they're, even in Silicon Valley, or maybe especially in Silicon Valley, where they don't, we know, let their own children use a lot of the technology they develop that other people who can't pay for as much childcare and all of that stuff do, heavily use with their own children. Does it feel to you as though there's a sort of crack in the foundation that felt like a pillar in the Obama era? Like Sheryl Sandberg has a new book out. Oh, great, let's get her on The View and say what a girl boss she is.
Well, I mean, I think there are a couple different things going on. And one, and I think you can separate them out. And in fact, one way to separate them out is to take Blake Masters out of the equation and put Elizabeth Warren in there instead. Elizabeth Warren wrote a best-selling book, I think more than a decade ago, with her daughter, called The Two-Income Trap. And it flows out of her politics. She has not kind of evolved into a different type of politician since she wrote that, or she doesn't have a different analysis of the American economy as she did then. Two-Income Trap basically said, I imagine you're familiar with this book. Yeah. It was saying that corporate America, and through the kind of the neoliberal power structure that was developing in the 1970s, is couching or smuggling in wage declines and the breaking up of unions and of the ability of a middle-class family to live a decent life. They're smuggling that in with the rhetoric of feminism and saying, isn't it wonderful that everybody gets to go to the workforce now? And she was saying that a middle-class family all of a sudden had to have two incomes, yes, rather than one, in order to have the same standard of living that they had 20 years ago. And when you put it that way, you're like, wait a minute, that doesn't actually sound like a good deal, because work sucks. Now, being kept out of the workforce because of your gender also sucks. And so they're playing those two tensions off of each other. And so I think in order to separate these things out and to do it in a progressive way, you have to pull gender out of it and say that whoever wants to be the breadwinner should have the same social kind of pressures and freedoms to be that breadwinner, but there should be enough worker power that you don't require both people to be working.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that at all.
And also plenty of these relationships are now 2 women or 2 men.
So the interesting thing about that is the Gallup data that showed it's actually a fairly small chunk of women with children under the age of 18 who say their preference is to work full time. So on paper, under 18, children under 18, yeah, who say that. This is from 2014 and 2015. Possible numbers have changed since then, but this is relatively steady over time. There are some changes. You can actually see it on the graph there. It does occasionally go up and down in interesting ways, but over time it's relatively steady. And so that, to me, it's where, like, on paper, absolutely very important to, say whoever wants to be the breadwinner, you should be able to do this on one income. Agree. That said, I think Sheryl Sandberg, lean in became more of a demand to women and less of a mantra, less of a suggestion. It felt like a demand. And I think because that resonates with so many women in media, the way we have this conversation nationally is so stacked for very highly educated women who are, have made an intentional decision to push family off or whatever, and just have different priorities than the majority of women. And so I just think the messaging for women, I mean, those two numbers are huge, that we have the first increase in the birth rate, small as it is, and a record number of women dropping out of the workforce in a way that actually coincides with their preferences. So, like, if you look at just that record number dropping out in a vacuum, it might sound like bad news. But when you see that most women prefer not to work full time if they have a child under 18, maybe it's good news.
But I think key context for that number that you're talking about there is that most of the workers that you're talking about, most of the women workers that you're talking about, are not executives at Facebook, who have flexible and enjoyable jobs where you can kind of express your intellectual curiosity and also express your dominance over thousands of employees and over the entire world. Like, if the question was, do you want that kind of job or do you want to be at home with the kids? I think a majority of people would be like, I want that job. The job sounds great.
The Facebook job?
The Facebook job. A lot of these.
Sounds miserable.
Yes, but also it's extremely well paid and compensated both with money, power, all of the things that people want. And so the majority of jobs though are terrible. And the people have very few rights and little power in the workplace. And so if you ask somebody who has a crap job or a BS job, as that great book talked about, then they're going to say, no, I don't want this job. I do this job because I have to. And so if you can have a revolution in the workforce where there's a more democratic workplace, a place that people actually enjoy going to rather than feel alienated going to, then you might see that number change. But if the alternative is oppression and alienation in the workplace versus not, people are like, okay, I'll take the not on that side.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I just, before we wrap, think there's a disconnect between women who, for nothing would compare for them, no job could ever compare to the joy of being with their child as they grow up and teaching them and taking them, through that. And so
but why gendered? Like the same is true for men.
Well, because I think it starts with breastfeeding. It starts with the physical connection between women and their babies, and there's all kinds of social science about how important the physical relationship between mothers. I agree the same is true of fathers, but women have physical demands that men don't in those situations. So I think it goes directly to that, and there are a lot of women who have those miserable jobs, more miserable than Sheryl Sandberg's, that can't breastfeed. They go back to work 2 weeks after having a baby, sometimes way less than that. And yeah, it's a sad state of affairs, I think.
Yes, life sucks.
Happy Friday from Ryan Grimm.
Yeah, I mean, I'm missing family day at kindergarten this morning. So.
The life of a working father.
There you go. That's a problem with these. Journalism is great because it's so flexible.
Yeah.
Except for TV journalism or whatever this is. It's it's not flexible.
And you're gonna have to.
The show's on at a certain time.
Right, and then you have to show up with makeup.
Yeah. So you got to show up when you got to show up. I had to explain that to him. It sucked.
Yeah. Well, Ryan, I'm looking forward to what's on your radar next.